Hi, this is Dr. Kurt Woeller from Integrative Medicine Academy. The title of this video is Immune System Activation from Gastrointestinal Candida. One of the things we know about fungal infections, which include Candida, is they're really prolific throughout the world. There are an estimated 1.5 million fungal species that populate the planet, with only a few hundred known to cause infections in humans, but those that cause problems are quite significant. So, for example, coccidioidomycosis, which is valley fever, histoplasmosis aspergillus, which is a mold, and Candida sort of being leading fungal contributing factors to human disease. The estimates actually suggest that there's over 600,000 deaths per year in immunocompromised individuals that can occur from various fungal infections such as cryptococcal meningitis. So it's a big problem. If you work in a functional integrative medicine practice, we're not necessarily dealing with people who are suffering with life-threatening infections, but these things can be quite problematic and really drain the reserves with regards to overall health. So one of the things to keep in mind about just Candida is the digestive system is the largest reservoir of Candida. And so as this article's mentioning here, Candida albicans is responsible for approximately 400,000 systemic infections annually. Now that would be defined as what's called candidemia or invasive Candida. And again, the human GI system is the largest reservoir. So we can't just sort of pass it over as though, oh, everybody has some Candida, which is true. It is part of our microbiome, but it can become a significant factor for some individuals, particularly those who become immunocompromised. Now, when we talk about fungus, that includes yeast. Candida would be a yeast, and it also includes the molds such as Aspergillus or Penicillium. And so we know that candidiasis is a fungal infection linked to any form of Candida species. And so it can occur inside our body and our skin. So it can occur in the esophagus, it can occur in the intestines, the mouth, or on our bodies, such as our skin or scalp. And then oral thrush, big problem for particularly elderly individuals, which can really affect their ability to eat food and comfortably swallow their food. Because if you've got an oral thrush problem, it's going to hurt. And then if it's in the esophagus, it's going to even hurt even more. And then we can see an image here of just cutaneous candidiasis. So one of the interesting things about Candida is its ability to become invasive, a process called endocytosis, where it sort of burrows itself into an epithelial cell. It can actually grow through an epithelial cell or between the epithelial cells, disrupting the tight junction. It produces different compounds. Candida lysine, for example, allows it to become invasive as it lyses cells along the epithelial lining. And then, as I mentioned before, it can actually grow in between cells. And the hypha that grow between cells can also traffic other organisms into the body, such as other Candida, staph, strep, for example, can use that hypha as a mechanism to gain entry. Now, one of the things that we have in our cells are what are called pattern recognition receptors. And there's many of these, the toll-like receptors, for example, dectin-1, dectin-2. Some of these are what are called lectin receptors. And what these do is recognize, when we're talking about fungal organisms like Candida, is it recognizes different components of the organism, particularly its cell wall. So a very common one called dectin-1 recognizes something called the beta-glucan layer of Candida albicans. It also, beta-glucan is part of Penicillium and certain species of Aspergillus. And so what these pattern recognition receptors are doing is they're recognizing the molecular pattern of these pathogens and then communicating that information to our immune system for a broader immune surveillance activity and overall immune activity. So it turns out that the beta 1,3 glucan layer of the Candida is highly immunogenic through the dectin-1 pattern recognition receptor. And so when the receptor recognizes that Candida, it is going to initiate a broader immune response. And what can happen is when the Candida becomes invasive, these pattern recognition receptors will recognize that behavior and then through second messenger systems translate that information into the inside of the cell, which then will trigger different transcription factors that activate the genome of the cell to produce different immune chemicals. So, for example, dectin-1 responding to beta glucan through second messenger systems can activate NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B will then have a signaling mechanism within the nucleus of the cell to produce different pro-inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. The production of those cytokines will then have a local effect. It could have a systemic effect too, but a local effect at trying to engage aspects of our innate immune system, such as macrophages or neutrophil, to help in the attack against the invading Candida. What's interesting is that Candida can also produce compounds like gliotoxin, which can disrupt this mechanism, which means it can actually disrupt the sequencing of NF-kappa B, compromising local cytokine production, which then compromises innate immune function activity, which then compromises the ability to attack the locally invading Candida. So the interaction is complex, but we can understand that these organisms are not just inert or just causing a local problem. They can create issues that cause problems in both the adaptive as well as the innate immune system that leave us compromised long term. So, as I mentioned before, one of the things that Candida does is has the ability to become invasive. And the way it can do that is it produces these hypha, these chemicals or this tail structure that sort of burrows itself through the epithelial lining, or it can grow sort of in between the tight junction. And then it engages an immune cell sitting in that subepithelial space, for example. We get production of interleukin 6, for example, which then triggers other cells, what are called Th17 cells, that are part of our adaptive immune system. So our innate immune system communicating with our adaptive immune system for a much broader immune attack. Now remember, we're trying to manage these pathogens at a local level. Okay, so just having good mucosal barrier function can keep these organisms intact, as well as having a diverse microbiome that keeps these fungal species localized as well. But once they become invasive, then we potentially have a problem. So we can start it if we have any issues in our innate immune system, it will start to reach out to our adaptive immune system to try to bring in other immune cells and immune chemicals to help in the fight. So for example, Th17 produces interleukin 17, which triggers neutrophils to attack the invading hypha. Interleukin 17, the Th17 cell also throws out interleukin 22, which throws out these little defensin peptides, these little hand grenades that try to kill the invading Candida at the mucosal level. All of this, of course, can drive up inflammation. And then chronic inflammation clearly has not only a compromising ability at the local level, but it certainly has an effect systemically as well. And so that Th17 cell is critical in this mucosal surface fight against these invading pathogens. So this was an interesting paper from the American Society of Hematology. This came out back in 2008, CD4 T cells, fates, functions, and faults. And what they're getting at here is it's a balance between the adaptive immune cells from Th1, Th2, Th17, and what's called T regulatory cells. I'm not going to go into all aspects of this, But I just want to point out that Th17 cells are really going after fungus, extracellular bacteria, or mucosal bacterial or fungus. That would be things mucosal, meaning in our mouth, our throat, our digestive system, for example. The other thing that's really important to understand is that Th17 can be involved in autoimmune reactions. And many times when we get an upregulation of certain T cells like Th17, it can actually cause a downregulation of other immune cells. So, one of the things to realize about fungal infections is that they have the potential to trigger autoimmune disease. And this actually occurs by an increase of those Th17 cells, which then cause a decrease of the regulatory T cells, which essentially are trying to regulate normal immune activity. So the way to think of this is that a fungal pathogen, okay, overgrowing in the digestive tract, will interact with the mucosal lining of our digestive system, and those pattern recognition receptors will recognize that organism and then trigger a local immune reaction. If that local immune reaction is not robust enough, then we get production of different chemicals which call in the adaptive immune system to try to deal with things from a more comprehensive standpoint. And that's where we start to engage the Th17 cells, for example, and some of these other cytokines that are attacking that candida. But because of that robust nature of immune activity, we can also then create imbalances in other regulatory T cell systems, which sort of will lead to imbalances in, let's say, Th2 or Th1, which could leave us prone to other types of infections. So it's a complicated series of interactions that's occurring, but it really begins in the gut with a breakdown in our immune system in the gut, and then just the inability of first our innate immune system to deal with the candida, and then just imbalances that occur within adaptive immunity that compromise our ability long term to deal with these fungal infections. And the other thing to realize too is that these fungal infections are producing different compounds that affect our body negatively, including aspects of our immune system. So it all really sort of begins in the gut, right? The microbiome is not only important for helping us to process nutrients from our foods, but it stimulates immune chemicals. It creates that mucosal barrier. It creates or helps to improve immune activity by building up immune tolerance. And so loss of the microbiome or diversity of the microbiome increases our potential for these fungal infections. And remember, these organisms are very sophisticated. They have their own desire to thrive and survive. And so they're sophisticated in what they want to do from an invasive standpoint or a survival standpoint. And so some strategies for reducing inflammation or autoimmune reactions from fungal infections can very much have to do with our diet. So, eating a healthy plant-based diet, fiber, multi-strain probiotics can be helpful. Just improving the overall microbiome diversity. Different things that helps to stimulate secretory IgA, that main immune chemical in the gut, colostrum, bone broth, glutathione can be helpful. And then if we have any infections, whether it's Clostridia, other bacteria, parasites, we try to do our best to eliminate those as well. If there is mold or mycotoxins, many of these mycotoxins that get produced by different mold can compromise immunity in the gut. Of course, chemicals like glyphosate, which are known to disrupt the microbiome, are also problematic. And then, of course, just again, working on underlying nutrition to sort of build up our energy reserves for proper immune function is always helpful, as well as using things that help to reduce inflammation, whether that's omega-3 fatty acids or curcumin, resveratrol can also be helpful. We know that these mycotoxins produced by mold have detrimental effect on immunity. Many of them lead to T lymphocyte disruption, macrophage problems, destroy natural killer cell activity, can lead to lowering of secretory IgA, can deplete glutathione, and many of them also target the mitochondria, and that would include mitochondria that are part of our immune system. Gliotoxin is a common mycotoxin of Aspergillus, but it can also be produced by Candida. And so an expression or an overproduction of gliotoxin in the body could lead to not only a downregulation of phagocytic immune defense, that would be our innate immune system, but it can also lead to impairment of T cell function, which is our adaptive immune system. So we can have a big problem in just dealing with these fungal infections from the mycotoxins that they produce. And then mycophenolic, another fairly common mycotoxin being produced by penicillium mold. I don't have any evidence that it is linked to Candida, but you'll often see it elevated. And mycophenolic can suppress the immune system, where people are now more prone to Candida and Clostridia infections. One other thing before I finish up this video is Candida itself, as I mentioned, can produce gliotoxin. And an interesting thing is that gliotoxin inhibits platelet function by interaction with what's called thiols. And essentially what's happening is that gliotoxin can interfere with platelet fibrinogen binding and platelet aggregation. And how it does this is it's a mechanism in actually how Candida can become invasive throughout the body. So it inhibits platelet activating factor, which is needed essentially in the immune response to try to trap pathogens or improve platelet aggregation for aspects of immune defense. And so this is really key. And again, it's one of the mechanisms, just one of many, that these organisms like Candida can use. And so, for example, Candida actually creates a chemical reaction, what's called a disulfide bridge, that's part of the gliotoxin molecule that can be damaging to different proteins. So again, the antithrombotic activity is likely to depend on the disulfide bridge of gliotoxin. Okay, so gliotoxin production coming from Candida could contribute to its survival in the bloodstream during vascular infection. So this is when it becomes systemic or invasive. Up top is the chemical structure of gliotoxin. You'll notice this disulfide bridge. Okay, in the this actually is what's called bis-methylthiol gliotoxin. So this is essentially another form of gliotoxin that inhibits platelet activating factor. So it's a PAF receptor antagonist. And so what's happened is these disulfide bridge has reacted with methyl groups on a particular protein. In this particular case, it would be inhibiting that platelet activating factor protein. Now, from a general simplistic standpoint, one of the things that can help against gliotoxin is the use of glutathione. Glutathione will go after that disulfide bridge, okay, and break it apart. Essentially, what it's doing is it's splitting that disulfide bridge before it has a chance to attack some other type of protein in our body. And that's kind of what this is showing. So this is reduced glutathione. Okay, essentially, it's going to attack that disulfide bridge of gliotoxin, break it apart, leave us with oxidized glutathione, but also leave us with a neutralized gliotoxin for the most part, so it can't do any damage. So when you start thinking about the chemistry of these things, it gets kind of interesting, because we have to start thinking, well, what else could gliotoxin do? Where else could it attack different disulfide bridges, for example? One of the things that gliotoxin does is attacks the mitochondria, particularly the intermitochondrial membrane. So one of the things that we can use when it comes to things like gliotoxin is glutathione, which could be helpful in neutralizing some of its toxic effects. We get into this material in great detail in our Candida Mastery Course through Integrative Medicine Academy. We get into aspects of looking at immune function, other pathogenic mechanisms of Candida, what's happening in the digestive system, bringing in information about other things that can cause problems in the microbiome, looking at mold, mycotoxins, chemicals, and then various protocols, supplements, and whatnot that can be helpful in diminishing the negative impact of Candida within our patients. So for more information about the Candida Mastery Course, you can go to candidamasterycourse.com, or you can email to candidamasterycourse@gmail.com. If you have any questions about any of our courses through Integrative Medicine Academy, please reach out to us at integrativemedicineacademy@gmail.com. You can also check out our website at integrativemedicineacademy.com. Again, I'm Dr. Kurt Woeller for Integrative Medicine Academy. Thank you.